Long Voyage Back, 1983. This is part 39. Part 4 of the book, called Land. Jean had slept while the men anchored Vagabond during the early morning hours, so that when she came up on deck a little after 6, she looked out on the boats floating nearby, the quiet, smooth water of the harbour, and the white buildings of the town blossoming up the hillsides in the distance, as a child might at her first big city. For more than 2 weeks she had known only the constant motion of the sea. Now Vagabond lay as still as if she were embedded in concrete. In all that time they had seen no more than 4 ships, one at a time. Now, as she slowly swept the horizon with her gaze, she could see 20, 30, more. For the last 2 days, since the explosion over San Juan, she had felt continual low-level anxiety. Now, surrounded by motionless white hulls, with white houses sleeping in the early dawn light less than a mile away, she felt that anxiety disappear. There was no exhilaration, no joy, simply a sense that here, for the moment at least, was a safe space. She moved into the wheelhouse and saw Neil stretched out on the cushions asleep, his bearded face and tousled hair showing his exhaustion even as he slept. She wondered if he had collapsed there, too tired to bother to go aft to his own cabin. He must have fallen asleep after they anchored only hours earlier. She slipped quietly down into the galley to prepare herself a cup of tea, then remembered that they had no more tea or coffee. She poured herself a small cup of water. Back in the wheelhouse, sitting opposite the motionless leaden body of Neil, seeing the slanted rays of the early morning sun sparkling on the golden hairs of his thighs and legs, she felt a wave of longing, tenderness and pride. They had come through, they had made it. But as she felt love welling up within her, she thought too of Frank. Then the beautiful body of Neil, so still in front of her, made her sad. It was too much for her. They were too much for her. There was no way she could create a world where all of her loved ones could be happy. Although she herself was beginning to feel at home on the water, her children needed the land. But the men, all of them really, seemed unenthusiastic about any of the permanent alternatives that they might find on these Caribbean islands. Here they were in Charlotte Amille in the American Virgin Islands. As far as she could tell, as safe and unhostile place as there was within 1,000 miles. And 2 of the men spent 2 hours the previous evening discussing the supplies they would need for another 2-week voyage and getting depressed because it seemed hopeless. She had tried to talk about what they could expect from St. Thomas, and although Frank had shown interest, Neil had done no more than give her a book to read. "What's that, Mummy?" Skip suddenly asked, coming up from his cabin and standing in front of her in his tiny red swim shorts and staring out the fleet of anchored boats and distant houses. That's land, honey," she answered in a soft voice so as not to disturb Neil. For a week now Skip had been asking, "When are we going to get to land, Mummy?" "That's land?" Skip asked, looking puzzled. "Yes. That's the city of Charlotte Amille, on an island called St. Thomas. We may live here for a while." "On a boat?" "No. On land in a house." "Like the one in Washington?" "No. Smaller, but nice." As Skippy pulled himself up onto the cushion beside his mother, he was silent, still staring at the distant town. "They don't look like real houses," he said. "They don't? Why not, honey?" After a pause he said, "They just don't." Neil stirred, adjusted a forearm under his head and chin, and then resumed his dead man pose. He had begun to let his beard grow, and was in that halfway land of looking scraggly and down and out. As she looked at him, affection and desire mingled with her sadness. "Do they have a McDonald's?" Skippy asked. "What?" "Can we go to McDonald's today?" Skippy repeated. "Oh, no, I'm afraid not. I don't think they have a McDonald's." "What about a big Whopper?" "I don't know, honey. We'll see." "Hamburger." It too will have disappeared. On the islands there would be no beef or lamb. Perhaps a little pork and fowl, but mostly fish. She smiled to herself as she realised that she was imagining herself having to announce to Skip the death of the hamburger. Could he take it at such a young age? Maybe she should sleep with both of them, she thought. She wanted to sleep with Neil, but she could never do so publicly, could never slap Frank in the face like that after he'd been so fond of her over the last 2 years. Perhaps she could become a seafaring camp follower, available to whichever officer was officially on watch, the way Katia seemed to have anticipated before they set out. But she knew she couldn't, and the tension that existed between Frank and her and Neil was painful. This landfall might represent escape from the waves and starvation and fallout, but there was no escape from themselves. When a customs launch arrived at 11, Neil was up, but the other men had to be awakened. Most joined Neil and the others topside, all haggard and grizzled or bearded, even Jem. They looked like the collection of refugees they were. Catchy's hair was tangled. She had lost several pounds from her already slight frame, but still looked healthier than the men. Lisa was a woman now, but because of her frailness she looked more like a child than she had a month earlier. Although they were nervous about the arrival of the customs launch, they had heard a radio report that the island government simply ignored the US military. Apparently any attempt to draft the mostly black islanders would have led to an instantaneous revolution. Even as it was, the local government, controlled by blacks but greatly influenced by white interests, was on shaky grounds. The senior customs officer was a nervous, pudgy white man, and his two-man crew, black. They searched Vagabond for weapons, all carefully hidden behind a false partition at the back of Jean's berth, asked detailed questions about their previous itinerary. They seemed to want to make certain that they had been at sea 9 days since the Bahamas, and, without a word of explanation, insisted on taking everyone's temperature. Just before the customs men left, Neil asked how he and his friends could expect to get food if they had no gold or silver or much else to barter with. "Then you fish," the pudgy officer answered. "New immigrants are eligible for food assistance unless they surrender all their belongings and live in the refugee centre out in Capo Gordia." After the launch had motored off, their weapons not discovered, they prepared to go ashore. Jim got the dinghy, and he and Macklin began to inflate it. Jean and Catchy were talking about the chances of finding a home on St. Thomas when a man and a woman suddenly appeared beside Vagabond in a little 8-foot rowing pram. "I say, you chaps, going ashore?" the man asked. He was round, red-faced man, his big chest and belly heavily matted with dark hair. Although the flesh sagged on him as if he had recently lost weight, both he and the woman, a bleached blonde, were in their 40s and were wearing rather spare black bikini bathing suits. "We are," Frank replied. "Why?" "We own the little blue Warram catamaran over there," the Englishman said, pointing. "Always willing to lend a hand to a multi-hull sailor, you know." "We appreciate it," said Frank. "Philip felt you might need some advice before you go ashore," the woman said, smiling. "He's very good at giving advice." "We've been at sea for more than 2 weeks," said Frank, feeling an unexpected pride as he spoke. "I guess we can use some advice about what the land world is like these days." "It's a bloody mess, is what it is," Philip replied, holding on to the Vagabond's combing with one of his big hands. "I know it's a bit presumptuous for me to come over here like this, but the world's got to be awfully small, and there's a chance to find a friend. I'd like to take it." "I see," said Frank, his mood wavering uncertainly between suspicion and acceptance. "Fact is," said the Englishman, "if you're going ashore for food and petrol and water, there's a bit you might want to know first, right?" "Would you like to come aboard?" Frank finally asked. "Don't mind if I do. Take the oars, Sheila." The large Englishman and his petite and pretty wife climbed nimbly up onto the Vagabond, and introductions were made all round. They were Philip and Sheila Wellington of the Catamaran Doubloon. A beer was brought up from Vagabond's wine cellar, the bilge, and passed around to everyone sitting around the wheelhouse and sipped reverently. "Bloody marvellous," said Philip. "Haven't had a good warm beer in more than 2 weeks." "Supplies are tight here too?" Frank asked. "Tight?" Philip snorted. "If your whole wealth consists of your bare boat, then your food consists of seaweed, shellfish, rainwater and fish." He looked at his wife with a warm smile. "We had no gold or silver, and we pawned Sheila's jewellery 10 days ago to buy sailcloth and a week's worth of food. The beer doesn't exist here these days." "Can food be bought?" "Some, I suppose, with gold, silver, diamonds, jewellery," Philip replied. "Ah, and with pot and pussy." "Such are at present the currency of your nation's former possession." Frank and Neil looked at him in certainty. "You'll have to barter first with the precious metal dealers, then with the individual merchants. Very few shopkeepers will barter themselves, except a few who will deal in cannabis and a lady's favours." "Is there a chance we can stay here, make a home here?" Jean asked. Philip looked at her, grimaced and looked away. "Not bloody likely," he replied. "I'm afraid the world here is becoming a bit of a black and a white thing, you know. Blacks don't seem to appreciate the fact that whites are blowing up the whole world and, then the survivors running to the blacks for help." But the Russians started it, said Tony from the port cockpit. Ah, well, I'm not certain too many blacks are sure of that. St. Thomas is all black? Jean asked. Pretty much so, Philip replied, and most of the refugees are white or now Puerto Rican. The rich whites who live here are holed up in various enclaves, those that haven't already left, that is. What are your plans? Neil asked abruptly from his seat in the corner of the wheelhouse. The big Englishman frowned. The bloody war's gotten too close, he said slowly. I suppose you know San Juan got hit. We've decided to leave. We want to be part of a convoy. A convoy? Neil asked. Pirates. You can't go 20 miles in any direction without having them all over you. Bloody trouble is, you can't know who to trust. A friend of mine sailed off with another ship 4 days ago, and yesterday his ship turned up stripped and foundering, while the other ship was reported sailing happily onwards 100 miles from here. The world's not a nice place these days. But where are you going? Neil persisted. Thought we might try Australia, the Englishman replied softly, staring at his hands. Australia? Frank exclaimed. My boat's too small, I know, said Philip, looking up intently, but I have a friend who's got a fine old wooden sloop, 55-footer, and she is, and... But Australia? Frank said again. Jesus, that's quite a sail. It's quite a world, Frank. I guess it is. England doesn't much exist anymore, you know, he went on intently. And since they bombed Puerto Rico and Venezuela, and the whites were massacred on the Dominican, no one feels any too bright about this whole area. Everyone who can afford it is getting out. Food was short before on all these islands. Now it's almost non-existent here. Things can only get worse, right? Have you stockpiled much food? Neil asked. Philip snorted out a half laugh in reply. There are two types here, those who've got their gold and silver and those who don't. The rich are selling it all to the fly out of here now, and the rest of us fish. He laughed, and though his belly shook, his eyes were not twinkling. What are you people planning to do? Asked Sheila suddenly. Frank didn't answer, and a strange silence ensued. Survive, Mackling finally growled. Oh, yes, I know, said Sheila, but, well... I'm sorry, Frank, said Philip, but I suppose I've got to ask also whether in this new world you're rich or poor. We're poor, Jean said. We only have a little food left, and none of the mineral wealth that passes for currency. We would never barter for enough food to go to Australia. Bit sticky for all of us, commented Philip. I'm glad you're poor, Jean, Sheila said. Anyone who has gold on his boat seems to have a lead anchor in his heart. Philip was saying as we rode over here, hope to Christ they're not hoarders. It's a paradox, I guess you'd say, commented Philip. The way things are, if you had plenty of gold, you'd be the type that doesn't share, whereas since you haven't any gold, we'd be likely to help each other. How do you figure that? Frank asked. Well, for one thing, give you advice on what you can and can't sell. For another, I've been here for almost a month, and I know not only St. Thomas, but what's happening throughout the Antilles. For example, when the war started, a few boats left for some of the islands south of here. But later starvation and revolution and civil war devastated 2 or 3 of the islands, and a lot of them came back. And now, after the explosion over San Juan, a lot of ships have put out to sea again. There still seem to be quite a few, Jean said. Philip looked briefly out the harbour. About a third less than on Thursday, he said. Half of them are motor yachts. None of them has the fuel to go anywhere, even if they wanted to. Some came in yesterday from Puerto Rico. Is it possible to rent a house? Jean asked. I suppose anything is possible if you have the means to pay for it, Philip replied. But you won't be welcome. Can we at least get water free? Neil asked. We've got less than 3 gallons left. Water's rationed. You'll get some, but not enough for a voyage. Jesus, what happened to the traditional Caribbean hospitality? Frank asked, frowning. It was obliterated, Frank, Sheila replied, her face as gloomy as the others. The day the white man began bringing disease and death south with him instead of tourist dollars. Husband also frowned. And of course, the other reason is the plague, he said. The what? Frank exclaimed. You'd better watch where you get your water from, Sheila explained. There's some sort of mysterious disease on the islands. Not many cases yet, and worse on Capo Gordia. that kills about half the people that come down with it." "Is that why the customs people took our temperature?" Neil asked. "Yes," Philip replied. "It seems the disease is carried by Americans from the mainland, or so they say." He was frowning and didn't raise his head to look at the others. There was an awkward silence. "Rainwater's safe," said Sheila. There was another silence. "When it rains," Philip added gloomily.